Well, thank you very much, everyone, for joining today. It's lovely to see everyone. Very unfamiliar faces, so it's lovely to see people I haven't met before. Just very briefly, I'm in Australia and I am Australian, although I actually was born in the US and I lived in the US and Canada until I was 4 years old. So I'm hoping I can get back to visit at some stage. I've been teaching for nearly 40 years. And I've worked as a class music teacher, a flute teacher, and also as a choral and orchestral conductor. I was very lucky also to be the director of music in a very large grammar school in Sydney that had a very active music department. That was very exciting. I've written quite a lot of books about flute teaching, and more recently, I've been commissioning composers to write works for intermediate flute, because I think that's like a bit of a gap that we have. So it's been pretty exciting to add new works to that. So I used to teach all ages, but I would say in the last probably 10 to 15 years, I've specialized very much in teaching beginners. And as I get to the later part of my teaching career, I'm really keen to work with teachers and pass on things that I've learned about teaching beginners through workshops such as this, and also through things like my blogs and newsletters. So what we're going to do today is to have a look at different ways to teach some specific pieces. The PDF for this, I think, will be in the chat, and it's also on the website if you want to download it afterwards to have to refer to, but I'll also show you the pieces on the screen so you don't need it right now. What I'm looking at is a variety of approaches. Like when flute teaching is not just about how to play the instrument. That, of course, is very, very important and essential. But it's also about giving our students insight into their music and giving them other skills that are valuable for them as musicians. Now, although we're going to focus on beginner pieces, if you don't teach beginners, you will actually be able to transfer the sorts of things I'm talking about to lots of other pieces. So I'll just share with you the first piece. So this first one, the Song of Joy, what I've tried to do is to choose music that you're going to find in a number of beginner books. You don't have to be using mine. This is a great piece because not only is it a beautiful melody, it only uses 5 notes. So it's possible to play it fairly early. Now, obviously, you would teach the notes and the rhythm. And the dotted rhythm at the end of, in measure 4 there, would probably need a little bit of work to get correct. I count that as 1 and 2 and. The other thing that I would be spending time on in this piece too is this is the first piece that I introduced slurs. So I would spend a little while with this, with teaching the concept of the slur and how to tongue that, which I do in sort of exercises beforehand. With beginners, I actually like to take things at a very gentle pace because I think in the first year or 2 years, it's really important to have enough time to work on things such as tone, posture, and hand position. There can be an emphasis just to learn lots of pieces and to get through lots of pieces, learn lots of new notes so we feel like we're making progress. But I think if we focus too much on teaching lots of notes in the first year, there's not enough time to establish those really essential beginning skills. So I do take it at a fairly gradual pace. So for example, in this piece, one thing I would look at would be the hand position. And when they're playing it, I'd be looking particularly at the position of their right hand thumb, making sure it hasn't gone too far through, and checking that they're not lifting their fingers too far away from the flute. In beginners, a lot of them have fairly tight sort of fingers, and to help them relax, it's good to have their fingers closer to the keys, and that's also really important for when they're playing later on. And I might do something as simple as just simply holding a pencil or a ruler above their hand so they can feel when their fingers come too high. Something else I might do is to check the another thing to correct fingering is to play a little freeze game. And this is where, as they play the melody, I call out the word freeze, and we then check where their fingers are. Now, I would particularly do this after they have played the note D, because what I'm looking for is to see, has Pinky come back on as we go back to C? Because so often they'll get it off for D, and then it will stay off as they come back for other notes. So I like sort of doing little things like that. So checking their hand positions while they're doing the pieces. I'd also use this piece for a short tone exercise. B is a wonderful note for getting a good sound on. It's a great note to do tone exercises from. So I'd be asking them to play this as a long note and keep this sound as they change their fingering to C, probably slurring to C, and really getting them to listen. So often young students play through things, but they're not really listening to themselves. So working on tone is a good way to encourage them to listen to their sound. So I would probably use the first bar as a tone exercise and help them not only listen, but also keep experimenting to see how they can achieve the best sound by changing their embouchure. Because at this stage, they probably still haven't established an embouchure that, is stable. Now, you'll see that I've put breathing every 2 bars. Depending on the student, they may or may not be able to achieve that. But what I would encourage them to do is to see how close they can get to that. If they're learning in a group, or particularly if they're learning in a band, there can be a tendency for them to breathe after every note. So when we check in sectionals or in flute lessons, we need to make sure that we're helping them with that. So I also like to do lots of breathing games. This one that I often do with beginners is simply using balls of crushed paper and a straw and blowing them across a desk or a flat surface. Now, initially, we would simply just use some pieces of paper in a little clump and just try to blow them with the straw. Then I would put them in a line and get the student to go from left to right as if they're blowing notes and try and blow those. Now, this photo is taken during an online lesson and the student just had a chair. But in a subsequent lesson, we moved to a larger surface so we could then put the pieces of paper a lot further apart. And then they're trying to blow, of course, for a longer time. Then I would also ask them to do the same thing, but to, instead of doing it with the straw, put their finger under their lip, as if they've got the flute there, and try exactly the same thing. Now, it's a lot harder like that than it is with the straw, but again, it's just helping them to get the idea of extending the breath. And with a lot of my pieces, another thing to help with breathing is that I put the words under the music. This makes it so much easier for students to understand breathing. If we sing a phrase, they understand where they take a breath and that they're not going to breathe between the 2 syllables. They're not going to breathe silver. So it can be really helpful to get them to sing the phrase to understand that the punctuation marks in the words will correspond to the breathing. I don't do that obviously with all pieces, just with some of them to help with that. I also love right from the beginning to let students feel the excitement of performance. Now, this might just be you playing a simple piano accompaniment with their piece, or a duet, or if you don't play the piano, using a backing track. But another thing that's fun with this piece is to play them an excerpt from Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, where the piece comes from, and watch their eyes light up as they hear that tune go from the very legato soft section to being played marcato by the full orchestra and then the choir coming in. Because remember, many students will not have heard this. We know where it comes from. We know what it sounds like in the original version, but that helps convey to them some of the excitement if you actually play them a little excerpt from the piece, where the piece comes from. Now, many of you would have beginners who are in a band. So you're going to be starting with B flat. So I try to incorporate both B natural and B flat into my early lessons so that the students feel equally sure of both. So what I might ask them to do is, after they've learnt the piece, then ask them to play the piece with B flats all the way through. Then I might say to them, well, what do you think of that? Does this music tell a different story? We can see that the title here is Song of Joy. What would you call your piece with B flats? They might come up with it could be Song of Peace, Song of Woe. It depends what they think of. I actually like to start talking about major and minor early on. Some teachers call these happy and sad, but I think that different students have different reactions to major and minor, and sometimes too it can vary according to their ethnic background and the type of music that they have heard. So I think it's interesting to ask them, what do they think for the, how does it change the mood by changing to the minor key? The other thing I might do, again, just for fun, is to ask the students to write new words for a song to reflect a change in key. So this little beginner piece with just 3 notes: in the silver moonlight, my good friend Pierrot, lend me your quill pen just to write a note. So I then might say, okay, let's play this piece now with B flat. And then say, well, can we now think of some words to change the mood? And it could be something like, in the spooky moonlight, my good friend the witch, please lend me your broomstick just to hitch a lift. Another different way I might present this piece is to ask the student if they could, after they have learnt the music, start instead on the note A. Now, they're still going to need B flat because we'll be taking it into F major, and just see if they can work out even just the first bar by ear. More capable students might be able to do a whole line, but even if they just start on a bar, then we're just beginning them on some transposition skills, something that is going to be very valuable to them later on, and it's never too early to start on that. It doesn't have to be difficult. It can, as I said, just be a single bar. It doesn't have to be the whole line. I also like, with beginner students, to start analysing their music in the first year of their lessons. So for this, I'd be looking at patterns, and I'd say, probably I'd circle this first one in purple and then say to them, can you find this pattern elsewhere in your piece? And hopefully they would find these other 2. Then I might circle this in section here, the dot rhythm there, and I might even do this one to see if they can find the little repeated section there. Now, not only is this useful in terms of analysing, it also helps to break the piece down into sections for them to practice at home. So particularly this little section with the slur, which is the new thing that they're learning in that lesson, or this section with the dotted note. Another thing too is, if they realise that if you get them to look at the patterns, they then can see how much of this piece is the same, so that their second and fourth lines are repeated, and the first line is almost the same as those 2. So really, all they have to learn is 2 lines of music. So what to them at first appeared to be quite a long piece is actually not very much to learn because of the repetition in it. A different activity for this piece would be to use it as the basis for a little composition. So what I might do in this one is take the rhythm of the 3rd line. So ta, 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 te, ta, ta, and so on, depending on how you call time names. The first thing I would do is to write for them or help them write out the rhythm above, the rhythm only, first so they have that. Then I'd ask them if they would like to try and, just for the first bar, improvise to find some notes that they like. Probably to begin with, I would keep them to the same notes as this piece, so just G, A, B, C, D. If you keep to a pentatonic, it gives them much more chance of success with their composition. And let them sort of have a bit of a play until they find some notes that they like for these first 4 notes. You can then write them down or help them write it down, either just simply as letter names, or they can write it on the staff if that's something that they're able to do. We might also talk about, look, this pattern that we found before, what might you do in your composition to have a pattern? So get them to start thinking about how is music put together? What sorts of things, should we be looking for in the music, and what can we do in our own composition? I might also say to them, talk to them a bit about, go back to the actual original piece and say, let's look at the finishing note and talk about how this is the tonic. I don't think that it's too early to talk about that and to suggest that they try and finish their tune on the tonic. You may get students who are happy to just experiment and try anything. But if we give them a few little rules to start with, it can be helpful. When they become more confident as composers, they can, of course, break all the rules. But it can help if we start off to suggest that they finish on that last note. If the student's not confident to improvise, what I do is use a dice to choose the names of the notes. So you can either get these ones that have pictures on them. What I do, though, is I just use a very large dice that I have, and we have 1 to 5 representing the 5 letter names. If they throw a 6, they get to choose any note at all. So that's an easier way if they're not confident enough to, sometimes if they're a bit shy, they don't want to actually try and just improvise things. Or you might ask them, would they like to try it at home by themselves and bring something back to you the next lesson? This is an example of a little piece that a 6-year-old was doing. And she actually was quite confident. She already knew a bit about dynamics from having learnt the violin. So she added those in too. Because after they've finished their piece, then I said to them, can you think of a title for your composition? And it's really lovely for them to have a little piece that they have written based on one of the pieces that they're learning. You can see here how she's actually used a pattern from there and there. She started on the tonic, and I'm afraid it's cut off here, but she did actually finish on the tonic as well. So she wanted to write hers on the staff. Most students that age would probably just be writing the letter names. So you can see that there are lots and lots of possibilities of things that we can do from just one piece. And I'm sure there are many more things that I haven't mentioned, because different teachers are going to see different things in the various pieces. So I'm going to go through some more pieces now, just with a few points per piece to cover a bit more repertoire. So the next one we'll look at is...
I didn't get that.
Sorry.
Could you try again?
That's my watch joining in. The next one is this French folk song. I'll just try to briefly play this for those of you who aren't familiar with it. So when we're working, especially with beginners, I think it's really important to relate their technical work to their pieces. Most students are not enthusiastic about scales. Occasionally, we might be lucky to have a student who enjoys them, but the majority of students will be very happy to play their pieces, but not so keen on their scales. But if they understand why we practice scales, they might be more likely to do it. So when I'm doing the French folk song, I always do this F major scale as a warm-up for the piece. Then I would ask the student, can they find a descending F major scale in the piece? And usually they will be able to find the scale in the last line, especially when they've played through the piece. Then though, I might also show them the first note in the first measure and in the second and in the third, and see, can they find another scale, descending scale here? Now to us, this is really obvious, but remember that for beginners, this probably will not be easy for them to find. They might need a bit of guidance. But when they can see that in fact, all they're playing is a scale, they realize that this piece is not a difficult one to do at all. They can then see the scale going up in these bars here. And I think too that with pieces like these that have conjunct movement or nearly all stepwise movement, another really fun thing to bring in for these pieces is to start a little bit of improvisation. Some students are very happy to explore playing a few notes around it, but many like some sort of basis. So I would encourage them to decorate the melody or to vary it a little bit and see what they can come up with. Like it's a great creativity exercise. So for example, they could add an extra note at the end of each measure. So da, 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 like something like that. Or they might change the rhythm of the piece and instead they might do this dotted rhythm for the piece. It can be very, very simple, but it's a start towards improvising with, as I said, a basis there for it. Another thing you could do with this is a reading challenge. You do both ear training exercises and reading exercises from the beginning. I think both are important. I don't think you can do one without the other. I think reading music from the beginning is very important because it empowers the student to be able to play anything without necessarily us being there. They can then pick up a piece and play it themselves. What I would do for a reading exercise on this one is ask them to play the piece backwards. So starting with this long note in the last bar and then reading from right to left, going backwards. Now, they might only manage one line, they might only manage a couple of bars, or you might have a student that can get the whole way through it. But a piece like this, which has a simple rhythm, is much more manageable. If when you have dotted rhythms, that's probably when I would only use it with the more capable students. But if you have a very simple rhythm like this, most students would be able to manage that. I should say too that as I'm going through these, if you have questions, please put them in the chat, because after I've gone through a few pieces, we'll stop and just have a look at the chat and see if there are any things that you'd like me to talk more about or any questions that you have there. So the next piece is a really fun one, the Can Can by Offenbach. And this is another piece that works really well when you're doing the F major scale. Again, you can see we have a descending scale in measures 7 to 9. This is a really good piece to introduce expression in music. As we know, if we change the tempo or the articulation or both, the whole mood of a piece can change. So after my students have learned this piece, I would let them then listen to the tortoise from Saint-Saëns Carnival of the Animals. That's has this tune in it. And in the piece, where it's used with the tortoise, it of course is played very slowly and very legato. It's the Saint-Saëns Carnival of the Animals is a fabulous work to use with students because the pieces are so short. They can actually listen to them in the lesson. There's enough time, or even an excerpt. And then I would ask them, can you now play that melody in the style of a tortoise? And see if they can change the way they play it to represent that. If I had time, or perhaps in another lesson, I wouldn't, obviously, these things I'm talking about, you would not do all of them in one lesson. You might use one of them in a lesson. It's just different things that might be brought in on different pieces. But another thing would be to then say, let them listen to the elephant from the Carnival of the Animals. It doesn't use the same tune, but it has a much heavier accent on each note. So then I might ask them, can they play it in that style? Or I might just say to them, without playing anything or listening to anything, if I ask you to be a cheeky monkey, how would you now play that piece? So again, they're learning different styles and different ways of playing, and learning how we can use music as a way to tell stories, and what we can communicate by changing the tempo and the articulation helps them realize how important these elements are in the music that they're playing. So another little piece here is Rigodon. So in terms of expression, we also introduce articulations in the first year of playing. I'll just briefly play this one. I think probably most people are familiar with it. So when I'm starting on this piece, it's introducing the element of staccato. So first I would be working on staccato tonguing, and probably what I would do is use in this preparation exercise, after they've learned that, then get them to play the top Gs in each section staccato. Then I think that we'd apply that to the pieces, and trying to make sure that in this measure, in particular, measure 3, I'd spend quite a bit of time on getting the contrast between 2 staccato notes and the other 2 tongue notes, so that they can hear and play the difference between those 2. Now, another thing I find with beginner students is that some of them can have a distinct problem with rhythm. And although this looks fairly straightforward, there'll be some that still will have difficulty playing it in time. Not all of our students have a natural feel for the beat in music. So a few things that I would do for those that need help with feeling the beat is, even before we played the piece, I would let them listen to the recording, and I would use some drumsticks we would play on the back of the chair to play the beat. It's great sometimes to move away from the flute. It's fun just to do something different for a few minutes. And by using the drumsticks, you can focus just on the rhythm. Then I might help them march in time to the music, so they can feel it in their body, feel the rhythm as they're hearing the music. For more capable students, I would ask them to march in time with their feet while they play the rhythm of the piece with the drumsticks. So the measures that probably would need special attention would be measures 2, this one as well, and at the end. The reason here is this dotted half note. Nearly all students will shorten these notes. Yes, you've got to fit a breath in, but it is not a 2-count note, it needs 3 counts. And so many students play these too short. Often, particularly when I'm adjudicating things, I hear the number of times that phrases are cut short. You've got to pay so much attention to the last notes of phrases, and often these last notes are cut short. So if you do a rhythm exercise first, it is then much more likely that they're going to remember to give this note its full number of counts. When I am first doing early duets and things with students, generally, I'd say in the beginning duets, the 2 parts have a pretty similar rhythm. But when they're getting to, this is like sort of getting further on in their first year, then the parts can have, a different rhythm. The second part have a different rhythm. That's where, if you've worked on the beat and on the counting beforehand, it's much easier for them then to keep exactly in time when the other part is playing a different rhythm. Now, the next one. This is a fun piece for Halloween, which I know we have just finished with, but you can keep it in mind for next year. I'll just quickly play. I've just got the audio for this one. This is the video. Okay, so another way I would work on rhythm and develop oral skills is to teach the rhythm of a piece by ear first. So as these are beginner students, I probably would only give them 1 bar at a time, and I wouldn't necessarily start from the first measure. So I might start, within it somewhere. Now, for example, what I might do is to give them some cards and play 1 measure to them, and then see if they can put the cards down that they hear. Again, when they start this, they might need a bit of help, but hopefully they can manage if you do it 1 bar at a time. More capable students, obviously, you can give a longer section to. Then I might work on another bar, like this one was from measure 7, but then I might look at measure 2 of the piece. So that quickly, you can see that there, this one here. Because what we're trying to do is to just make sure that they can see these pieces, these bars start the same and then they finish differently. So this one has the 2-count note. Then I would probably go back to measure 1. Why? Because 1 ends with a 1-beat note and a 1-beat rest, whereas 2 was this. Now they're going to sound pretty similar. So if you're doing it for them as an oral exercise, they may find it difficult to hear the difference between these. So you might have to go over that a few times. But again, if they can hear that, then when they come to play it, hopefully it will actually sound different, and this note will actually get the full 2 counts that it needs. I also like to teach my students about the background of the music that we're playing. Now, I know not everyone celebrates Halloween, but I feel that my students can at least learn what it is, and more particularly, why is this piece about black cats? And what I found out was that it's based on a ancient Celtic festival, and there was a Celtic fairy creature that apparently resembled a large black cat, which has then become associated with Halloween. So just little things like that can be fun for them to have a bit more information about what it's about. In terms of music, I like to explore lots of different music from different cultures, Now, for example, I would teach my students some music from the Jewish festival of Hanukkah. Now, I'm not Jewish, nor are most of my students, but I think it's really important that we teach our students about other faiths and cultures, because through the music that we play, I think this can help with a better understanding of other people and help our students to respect that people have different faiths and different beliefs, but that we all can enjoy this, to all enjoy making music together. With the Black Cats piece, this is another one that is fun to play in different styles. So I would ask the student, after they've learned the piece, how can you change the articulation of this to make it quite different? So, for example, they might play these first 3 notes tenuto, and then they might slur all of these. Who knows what they might come up with? An alternative is sometimes when a student has learned a piece, a little bit like the idea with the carnival of the animals that I referred to before, I might show them some photos and say, can you play it in the style of a slinking cat? Or can you play it in the style of a playful cat? And again, just see what they might come up with for that. Another thing would be back to changing keys. So we might put this into D major and see, how does that change the piece? How does it change the sound of it? So again, have them thinking about the music, not just simply learning the notes and playing it, but actually thinking about the music itself, how it's constructed, and especially the story that it's trying to tell. This would be another piece that I think articulation is very important, and you can help the student in terms of if they change the articulation of this piece, say to staccato, the story the piece tells is totally different. So it's another great one to show how important the articulation is, that they need to pay attention to the details in the articulation. I think this piece too would be either, I would say, very end of first year, more likely into the second year of learning. I would use this in the second year, where they're still beginners, but they're, more advanced beginners. And I think one of the really important aspects of this piece is them learning why we use dynamics and how we use them for expression. I don't actually teach dynamics in the first year of lessons. I don't teach dynamics at all in the first year. I think it's really important to first establish a very secure tone, and I prefer to do that before you start trying to modify it. I find I have much better success if I bring in dynamics after they have a really secure tone. So with this piece, what I would be doing with the dynamics at first is getting them to exaggerate them. So really, da 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 da, like over the top type dynamics, so that they can see where the dynamics fit in. Then, when they've got the idea of them, then I would get them to modify them so it then becomes much more musical. If they've been doing this piece for a while, I would also use it to start things like memorizing. So I might give them a version where I have given the start of a phrase, maybe the end of note, and trying to get them to see if they can fill in the bits in between. I would start out with very small sections, but again, it's a good way to start memorizing is just to work on little sections, not expecting them to do the whole piece at once, but just giving them little segments with little help in between for those. The other thing that I might do within that would be to use it as an improvisation exercise. So I'd give them this piece, blank out these sections and say, okay, start with these 2 notes. Then I want you to make up whatever you like, as long as you then finish the phrase with this. So this again is after they have learned the piece. So they have an idea of the number of beats that they need in between here. And it might be something, again, as simple as changing a note one step up or one step down. But just giving them the idea that it's, so that they've got some sort of guide for their improvisation. And it also can just be a fun way of exploring a piece even a bit further. So before I go on any further, I'm just going to see are there any questions that people would like to ask? Please feel free to ask. Just pop it in the chat. I can see the chat now. Please feel free. If you need to, stand up and have a stretch. If you've been sitting for a while. I'd be interested to know too how long people have been working with beginners, or whether you work, extensively with beginners, or if you only have a couple of beginners. Anything that you'd like to communicate. Or put your microphone on and just ask me. Anything at all.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
My name's Susan, and
Hi, Susan.
I was an elementary band teacher for 33 years, and I mostly, the last 28 was beginners, and I just loved it because the kids are so excited and their parents are excited, and you take them from not even knowing how to open the case to putting on a concert by like February, and this is great. I thought you were going to be talking maybe about specific things about getting tone and all this, but I really like your approach here. Being a band director and having so many students, 3, 4, 5 in a lesson for a half hour, by the time they even get in the room, get the instrument out, you're down to 20 minutes. It's a lot of the things you're doing would be with like a private student rather than a class of one.
Yes, no, very much so. This is more for teaching specific pieces with private students. Certainly the other things you're talking about, like tone and things like that, I do entire workshops just on that one topic. No, that's one topic. There's such massive things with beginners. I do another workshop which I talk just about the embouchure and things like that, because they're huge things to do. And I think those, those you say, especially with the bands, that's a really big part of it. And having so many students at once, it is very challenging, because different students are going to have, some are going to get the embouchure straight away and others aren't. And that's where it is very, very challenging. But you're absolutely right. What I'm going through now is intended more for private lessons with students and working on them one-on-one. But, I'm totally with you on that's part of the reason that I suppose I've gone to specialising in beginners. It is just so much fun. It is so exciting. And like, even just that first lesson and opening the case and learning how to open it, which way is up, and getting the instrument out, and the look on their faces when they get a sound, it's a very, very rewarding group to work with.
Yeah, I would always tell them, whatever I taught you here, I want you to go home and teach your parents.
That's great, yeah.
Once you've taught something, it's cemented in your own head. But all of these tunes that you're using, that you kind of bounce all these other things off of, tone and dynamics and all this, are they in one particular method book, or are these pieces that you put together yourself for a method?
They're all from my method books. On the PDF, you'll see at the bottom, it's a series called The Young Flute Player.
Okay.
So it has there are the method books, and then there are duet and trio books and things like that. So it's an actual sort of series. So yeah, it's they're from that series. So I can see another question from Amy. How many lessons do you typically spend with one piece with all the creative variations? That is an excellent question, because as I said to you, I like to take things at a gentle pace with beginners. I'm not trying to get lots and lots of new notes in the first year, just sticking to sort of a range of notes. This is a way that you can spend more time on one piece. But the other thing is, I might Like I wouldn't necessarily spend consecutive lessons. What I might do is we might learn a piece and do some of these creative variations. Then we might start on another piece, but in the next lesson, I'd spend 5 minutes going back to the previous piece and doing another variation on it. So bringing it back in and then maybe doing different things with it so that we're still working on a piece over several weeks, maybe even up to 6 weeks if you're doing different variations on it. They can still then keep working on that piece, refining that piece, doing it in different ways without getting tired of it. Because if you keep doing it in different ways, they don't tire, and you can be focusing on things like, you know, their tone, their hand positions, their body position, all those really, really crucial things that we need to establish in that first year. Anybody else? Just pop your microphone on if you've got a question.
Hi. My name is Cynthia Cosette Lee. I'm Philadelphia. I'm a composer. I did at one point teach beginning flute. I'm not doing that any longer, but my question to you, I was a bit concerned about one of your images of animals was a monkey. And I'm African American, and I know in the Black culture, you know, the monkey has been used to denigrate the Black people. So I was wondering about why you chose a monkey, and have you had any negative reactions from some of your parents about that so far?
Okay, so that one I simply did for this session. It's not in the book. It was just something I put together for this session, just giving some examples of different animals. To be honest, I just went for some different animals that there were icons of on the Google thing. I wasn't attributing any sort of connection to the animals. And again, I probably, like with the students, I wouldn't even necessarily be showing them the images. I would simply be playing the piece, because I was saying I was talking about the tortoises and the elephants. And rather than playing those pieces in this session, which I thought might take too long, I just popped those images on. So I apologize if that has caused you any offense. It was not intended at all. And it's not something that I would generally do. And if I'm using pictures of animals, usually rather than like an icon, I will just have like little, you know, pictures of fun sort of pictures of different animals. And with a whole collection of animals, I would have to say I've used lots of animals and I've never had any comment from any parent, but that perhaps is because of a different ethnic background.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Yeah, I particularly liked your method of the going forwards and the backwards and the students doing variations on the songs, because that's one way of making it interesting for learning that. I thought that was very good method. Thank you. Thank you for sharing.
You're welcome. Thank you. Yeah, I think it's just, you know, thinking of approaching the music in different ways. And as I said, that's, you know, the main thing for this session is thinking of different ways of doing the music. What Susan was asking before, the actual technical part is something I do in other workshops where we just focus on the actual technical production of the sound and those sorts of things. This is more focused on the music itself and how can we make it interesting. And I think, as I've said, I don't go as fast as some others do in that first year. And this is how I still keep it interesting for them. Because for me, I don't want them to have, when I say, if they've got lots of new notes to think about, they can't focus as well on all the other things. You know, there are so many things to think about that all come to us totally naturally. But when you've never picked up the instrument before, there are so many things you're trying to think of at the same time. And not only holding the instrument and blowing the instrument, reading music. I mean, depending on the age of the student, that can be a huge new thing as well. So there can be so many things they're thinking about. And that's why I like to have plenty of repetition, but in different ways, so that they have plenty of time to consolidate those essential skills in the first year. Any other questions?
I have one other. At what point, this is Cynthia Cosette again, At what point do you do the open holes then? How advanced does your student have to be before you go into the open hole flute as opposed to closed holes?
That would vary very much on the age of the student. So I feel again fairly strongly that it's very important that students have the right instrument for their size. So what's happening now is that we're getting younger and younger beginners. Like when I started the flute, most people started it around at the age of 11 or 12. Now it's not at all uncommon to get children the age of 6, 4, even 4 and 5. And that's where I think it's really important to have the right flute. There are many small flutes available now, some plastic ones. There are also variations on silver flutes, such as the curve flute and the wave flute. The wave flute is one that's very easy for them to balance, which works well. So I think that the most important thing is to have the right size flute. Now, in terms of the holes, that will depend too on the size of their fingers, because if they have very slim fingers, it's going to be a lot harder for them to cover those holes without distorting their hand positions. So I would say I take them off gradually. I don't do them all at once. And I would do them when I can see that with a nice hand position, when I'm happy with the hand position, they are comfortably covering that hole. So it would depend on the size of the student and their hand positions, and I would take them off gradually as they can comfortably do them.
Thank you so much. Very insightful. Thank you.
You're welcome. Any other questions?
Yes,
Susan?
yes. You may have said this and I might have missed it, but I know you said you spend like maybe 6 weeks on the piece with all the variations. Do you go on to another piece as well, or do you really
Yes.
just? Okay.
No, definitely. Yes, I did mention that I might continue revising it over that period of time, but in the meantime, definitely I would have gone on to other things as well. I wouldn't stay on one piece exclusively. So that would be like what I would call a revision piece. So we might do that towards the end of the lesson and do something a little bit different, but I would definitely be going on to other material. And I wouldn't do this with some pieces. There's nothing much you can do with them. Other pieces, there's a lot you can do with them. So it would vary as to, how many other pieces. Again, I try with my beginners not to give them too many things to work on at home to practice. I'd rather that they practice them more thoroughly than that they're really stretched and simply just playing through. So another workshop I give is about practicing, and I very much believe in breaking things down into manageable little chunks that they practice rather than just playing from A to the end. I don't just want them playing through the piece. That's why too, I definitely, like in all of these things, I have exercises that they prepare before they start the piece, or scales that they do before the piece, so that then the piece is much more manageable. Like in the exercises, I pull out the tricky sections of the piece and work on that first, so then the piece is more manageable. So for their home practice, I would then be saying, work on this exercise the most, and then have a go at the piece. And then we might work again on the piece the following week. But yeah, I would definitely be doing other new material as well as these revisions. And it depends a lot too on the student, because sometimes they will just love a piece and they will enjoy doing it in numerous ways week after week. Other times you can see it doesn't really connect with them. It's not really a piece of music that they're really enjoying. So I would then move on to something else. So very much I would have a different approach. And that's where I can't remember the name, the person who was talking before, or Susan, who was talking before about the groups. This is more an individual approach. Again, the way I work with groups, I did a session early this year exclusively about working with groups. And that's where I was talking about very different techniques that you use when you're teaching to a group.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, we can take one more question, or we can just wrap it up. We have just a couple minutes.
I have a question I might ask. Hi, I'm Taylor. This is really fun. So I'm actually a DMA student in Texas, and I mostly teach college level students, and I just recently started teaching beginners, like within the last month. And I had this opportunity, so I have like 20 of them, and I'm like, I have no idea what I'm doing. I feel like, and it's so funny. I went to the first lesson, and I like gave them music, not even thinking like, oh, they don't even know like the fingering for all of these notes, and so there's all of these things that I have never even thought of. But in any case, my question is, they're sort of all at, none of them have ever had lessons before, but they're all in band and they're public school things. And so like, they're just having a hard time even making a good sound. But because they've been in band for 3, 4, 5 years, some of them, like, they're playing music that is, is much more difficult than I would imagine that they should be doing. And so I'm sort of struggling with trying to figure out how to catch them up in some areas, of their flute playing, while not keeping them bored with other things. They need to be playing whole notes right now or something, but that's not what they do in band. And so I'm sort of just struggling with what to do in this sort of situation.
Yeah, it's really tricky. I mean, bands are not the ideal situation for flutes. It's really hard. It's fabulous if flutes can have sectionals or, so do things separately. With something like that, where you say they've got a lot to catch up on, I would even be doing things like head joint fun, where you just get them to just have a session working on the head joint. And there are so many games you can do with head joints, working on their sound and trying to help them get a good sound. I might do another session where I'm just working on certain fingerings. So say, okay, today we're going to, and, put them in teams and get them passing a fingering from one person to the other in the team, like, passing to check that they've got the correct fingerings. Because often when students have had to go too quickly, that's where you'll find there can be lots of problems with their fingerings, lots of problems with how they're holding the instrument, and even with the actual embouchure. So I'd start picking out just little elements that you can focus on, but do it in a fun way. Again, I do complete workshops just on games because I find them such a powerful teaching tool, even with adults. Like, adults enjoy playing games too. It doesn't matter what age. It's just a way then of being able to focus on a particular element, but in a fun situation. And particularly with groups, if you make it into little team things, they can really enjoy doing that. But yeah, it sounds like you've got quite a challenge on your hands there.
Okay, well, thank you. And you've mentioned all of your other workshops before. Where can we see these? Where can we find all of these things?
Well, I've got a website. I'll just briefly show you. If you go to this website, Allegro Music Publishing, that's just me. It's not a company. Well, it is a company, but it's just me. That website is where I have all the workshops. I've actually, because in Australia, we've actually just finished, or we're just finishing up our academic year. I'll just see if I can pop that in here. I don't have any more for the next month, but I'll be doing more next year, and some of them there are recordings. But yeah, I love working with teachers who are just starting to teach beginners, because it's a whole new world. It's very different from teaching students that already know how to play the instrument. Well, thank you very much all for coming. I really appreciate your time here, and I hope that you found something helpful. As I said, teaching beginners is such a joy, and I wish you all the very best with your teaching.
Thank you, Karen. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today.
Yes, thank you very much. It was a
Thank you.
very good stuff.
Thank you. I'm glad you found it helpful.
Very helpful.
Thank you. Bye-bye.